The refugee crisis is a direct result due to unsolved conflicts resulting in the forced migration of thousands of people having to leave their countries of origin. Many countries from around the world have made attempts at addressing the refugee problem, either from a post-conflict approach or by tackling its point of origin in an attempt to mitigate problems before they've increased. The Syrian conflict has produced thousands of refugees. Although many developed countries have been providing assistance, ironically it is the developing countries which have been providing the most. Today we are discussing the Syrian refugee crisis with Professor David W. Haynes. He holds a doctorate degree in anthropology and has previously worked for the federal government's refugee resettlement program. We will also be discussing the Syrian crisis with Asha Athman. She is a global affairs major with a concentration in international development and refugee resettlement. What exactly is a refugee, if you could explain to us your definition? And I know you've probably heard this question 100 times.
The problem with the question is that there is not a simple answer. And that's the most important part of the answer. People generally go to the UN definition, which you all probably have spent some time with. It has to be on a particular kind of ground, like religion or nationality or, political opinion. And then it has to be persecution. Actually, it's a psychological standard. It's a fear of persecution standard. And you actually have to cross a border to be a refugee. But there's a much more generalized meaning to that term. And I think Americans understand that generalized meaning much better than they understand the UN definition. The UN definition has been useful in some ways, but very damaging in others, particularly in US law, because it's tended to separate the issue of refugee from the cultural and religious roots of the United States. So in more general terms, I think everybody understands that sometimes people have to get out, and sometimes they have to go somewhere else, and they need some kind of refuge. Might be temporary, might be permanent, and I would encourage people to remember that, because it ties much more into the moral and cultural roots of what refuge is about, and how common it is to the human condition. We are mobile. So the Syrian case, it provides an example. So in 2015, because of the Syrian refugee crisis in Europe, which, as you know, involves, like 6 million internally displaced, 5 million elsewhere, 1 million in Europe, Obama says, well, we're going to add 10,000 to our refugee quota this year, and we're going to resettle 10,000 Syrians in the United States. And it's going to take us a calendar year to do it. So meanwhile, Justin Trudeau is running for Prime Minister of Canada. And he says, there's a Syrian refugee crisis here. We should take some people in. Let's take 25,000. Now, that's 2.5 times as much, right? Mm-hmm. But the United States is 10 times as big. So the Canadians are proposing on a per capita basis to take 25 times as many Syrian refugees as the United States. And they're already taking about twice as many on a per capita basis of refugees anyway. And Trudeau says, let's do it in 6 months. So it got through. I think the Canadians were a little bit stunned at first. It's like, well, this is a big task, 25 times as much as the U.S. is going to do. Well, they got it done in 6 months. And the U.S. barely got the 10,000 done in a year. All right?
Yeah.
And then comes Trump. So it's Americans. All they know is that the number coming to the United States is high, but they don't understand that because America has a big population, it's not because we're brilliant or anything. Of course, any U.S. number is bigger than anybody else's number. Just like China's economy is going to be bigger than the United States because each individual Chinese is more productive than each individual American. It's just like China's a lot bigger, And maybe each individual Chinese will be as productive as each individual American sometime farther down the road, but the sheer size of it. And maybe it lulls people, so they can throw out a number like, we've got 50,000 people coming to America on diversity visas. Why are they coming? Well, 50,000 is nothing in the United States. So I think there's I was talking about risk analysis, but there's also an issue of scale analysis that Americans just can't get it in their head about what it means when 1 one person is shot, or how do they process that information? And I think the solution, I mean, it's partially an educational problem, right? People need to be educated to that. But unless Americans can do that, unless Americans can grow up and begin to think through government, they're just not going to have the skill to make reasonable decisions, and then they're just pushed back and forth by the politicians. And one of the ironies about the Syrian case is that all these people that Trump decided not to let in were generally a pretty good profile, because there weren't many people coming out to North America so well vetted, and they probably would have done pretty well. But then you've got the humanitarian case that are not going to do well. So every time you look at one of these sets of stats about participation in the labor force, you've got some different dynamics going on there. The people who are getting jobs are often the people. Of course they're going to get jobs. Anybody would know that looking at their skills. And the people who aren't, you look at their skill level and maybe their family responsibility and say, well, of course they're going to have problems. So that's the problem. So there's not a good answer. Let's get the good refugees. Stats will look good. Let's get the difficult cases, and our stats won't look so good, but we'll be doing better humanitarian job. And I think the Obama administration, the numbers they were a little bit higher than Bush, not a lot higher, but I think there was a real willingness to take tougher cases. Also, people who've been in camps for longer. Because if you're in camps for a long time, people tend to, they lose the structure of a working life.
Yeah. Morale as well. The morale becomes low.
Yeah.
They tend to give up hope.
So I know the data, and I could give you a little academic article that shows that refugees do terrible, and I could do another one that says, well, they're doing great. But I think it's hard for Americans. So Americans tend to see the refugees who stick out, and refugees who are not doing as well tend to show up in inner cities, so they're more visible, versus other refugees who are doing better, who are middle class already, who kind of filter into the suburbs, and often filter into suburbs of people who are a little more cosmopolitan, multiracial, and they look like middle class people.
What kind of possible solutions for the refugee crisis?
The country is on such a steep decline in terms of values and of memory of what America can be about, and so kind of regressive. It's not that there's competing futures. It's like nobody's really trying to articulate what a future would be. So I'm not very hopeful. In one sense, maybe the U.S. will ride this out. But once the numbers, for example, on refugees go down, and then somebody comes back in and says, well, instead of 20,000 refugees, I want to go back up to 70,000, then you have a different kind of dynamic of people who are likely to reject that. So I'm not hopeful about it.
So the Syrian conflict kind of began in 2010, 2011 with the revolution, and I guess you could call them popular uprisings. Sometimes people don't like to use the term revolution in regards to the Arab Spring, but you could also call them popular uprisings all over Syria against the current leader in Syria, Bashar al-Assad. And this, you could call it like popular uprisings because they happen in several different cities, but it wasn't something that was necessarily organized in exactly what the outcomes were meant to be. I think a lot of different people in different cities had grievances that were specific to their localities, and also general issues with the government, and I think other issues related to economic challenges facing Syria after Syria kind of transitioned from being a socialist state to more of a neoliberal economy really affected people, and also just certain kind of political alienation that was affecting communities that kind of is traced back to Bashar al-Assad becoming the leader of the country and taking over from his father, Hafiz al-Assad. So that is kind of it in a nutshell. And then also Syria has had a significant Palestinian population also at that time. And so, for instance, Palestinian refugees had their own types of grievances that they were dealing with. So that's what you could say. It was even complicated from the beginning of the revolution. But that is kind of how the crisis in Syria started. And then you could call that phase one. and then you kind of transition into phase 2, which is like civil war time. And then actors in Syria are difficult to sometimes outline exactly who is important and when they're important. But the kind of actors that you generally hear about are Bashar al-Assad and like the formal Syrian army and defense forces. And then you have the Free Syrian Army, which is like conglomerations of different militias and armed groups that are the opposition to the formal government under Bashar al-Assad. And then you have kind of like different terrorist organizations that have changed their names over time and like broken ties with each other. And all of these actors are very complicated because it's kind of the overlap between the Free Syrian Army, ISIS or ISIL that it was at the time, Jabhat al-Nusra, and all of these kind of different organizations had relationships that changed over the years. And so I think sometimes it's difficult to say like who is in what camp and what are they trying to defend. But what happened during that time is, and it's something that most people know from watching Syria on the news or learning about Syria, was that ISIS took a significant amount of territory in Syria and the northern part of Syria. And what happened as a counter reaction to that was the entrance of Allied forces, Allied, you could say Western forces, including the United States, and certain Arab countries as well, to start airstrikes in Syria to fight terrorism and to fight ISIS. And then also the Syrian government attempting to fight ISIS as well, at the same time fighting its opposition that comes in the form of the Free Syrian Army. Debates from the West about whether or not it should arm the Free Syrian Army, if it should assist the Free Syrian Army, people being unsure about what exactly is the Free Syrian Army, which is also something that's difficult to define. It's something that you have to like look at very, I think like minutely, like come from group to group, from area to area. But what kind of like the outcome, and then like the entrance of Russia also on the side of Bashar al-Assad to fight terrorism and to fight ISIS, as well as sometimes we discuss as like the Iran proxy and the assistance of Iran to the Syrian government, as well as Hezbollah in Lebanon assisting the government. But I think sometimes what people would say their objectives were for entering into Syria were kind of different from what happened on the ground. And so that's why there was many like discrepancies and difficulties about why were there Russian airstrikes in this area? Is the Syrian government actually fighting ISIS in this area, or are they fighting like their domestic opposition that isn't made up of any type of foreign fighters and that type of thing? So I think it's very complicated to that point. But now in this phase 3, what we've seen is that ISIS has been pushed back in a lot of ways, has lost a significant amount of territory, and now kind of people are talking about the final front is basically this city called Idlib that is in northern part of Syria. It's very close to Turkey. Turkey has taken a significant amount of refugees into its country and is very concerned about the fighting in Idlib because there's a very large Syrian population that lives there, and it's very close to the Turkish border. So in the event that there's fighting in Idlib, those refugees would go to Turkey. And so that's kind of created a diplomatic issue between Turkey and the rest of the world. Like Turkey's basically saying, like, we can't take any more refugees, so we have to stop this fighting from happening. But the Syrian government in a lot of ways has also kind of won its war against the opposition. So in most of the conferences that I've been in recently, this phase 3, where the Syrian war eventually ends and Bashar al-Assad seemingly would come out of the Syrian war as still being the leader of Syria, is what happens after that. So I think that is the kind of where everyone's at now. Like, what is the post Syrian war space going to look like? And there's kind of a shift away from discussing terrorism as much in Syria. What programs and organizations? So there's a lot of programs and organizations helping Syrian refugees. And how they're being helped by the U.S. So the U.S. is a huge donor to UNHCR. The U.S. is a huge donor to the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and the U.S. like contributes a lot to different like UN organizations that help refugees and refugee children specifically, including UNICEF. And so the UNHCR has kind of been on the forefront of assisting refugees in an official capacity in the Middle East and North Africa. But obviously their assistance level is also limited. Like they have a very underfunded budget in Syria for all of the countries that they're doing work in. So for instance in Jordan, the Syrian refugee like funding needs are about 274 million, and right now they have about 17 or 18 million. So it's like they only have 6% of the 100% budget that they need. So I think like that's kind of an indicator of the limitations to the assistance that they can give. But the one thing that's amazing about the UNHCR is that if countries in the Middle East, the main countries that host Syrian refugees are Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. Iraq used to host some, but I think the numbers have changed a little bit because of the conflict that happened in northern Iraq, was Muslim in northern Iraq, and Egypt hosts like the next amount, which is still like a smaller amount. But the thing amazing about UNHCR is that those countries work with UNHCR, then UNHCR can register refugees and they're available to get certain benefits. And UNHCR works with a number of other organizations, local foundations, as well as international organizations that you know about usually, which are like the International Rescue Committee, and CARE, Save the Children, other organizations like that, that come in and then try and provide services that they have like grants and funding in order to give. So that kind of gives assistance to the UNHCR where it falls short. And that's kind of how refugee assistance happens all over the world. It's not something that's unique only to the Syrian crisis.
In your opinion, what are the possible solutions to the refugee crisis, specifically dealing with the Syrian crisis?
Yeah, I think that what's needed is that kind of like focus on integration, so allowing Syrians to integrate into the areas that they've already moved into. So this is like in Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, but not in a way necessarily that entrenches them. So we don't have to say that that refugees have to become citizens of those countries, but giving them kind of like the facility and mobility to be part of the societies that they live in, and not kind of either being an economic underbelly and a bit exploited, or completely separated from society. So they're kind of like put in areas to themselves, which kind of happens in Lebanon, where you put people in camps and they're a bit separated from Lebanese society. And I think the integration kind of framework would be the best type of solution, where people kind of have the ability to remain kind of, how do you say, remain empowered, like they can go to school, they can work, but at the same time they can kind of prepare themselves for their future. Some countries also now, like these countries are also facing a lot of difficulty because, like I said before, they're not receiving the funding that they necessarily need to assist refugees. They've also taken in the most amount of refugees and don't have as much resources as other countries that are refusing to take in more refugees. And by that I mean Europe and the United States especially. Europe has taken a lot more refugees than the United States. And Australia too is part of that. So I'm not sure if third-party resettlement is necessarily the answer to that, but we do. I think third-party resettlement needs to be facilitated in a better way to alleviate the burden that's facing the countries that are currently. You can't have both. There can't just be no third-party. There can't be limited third-party resettlement and no funding, because then there's no answer. So I think kind of like coming to an international agreement about maintaining the funding for the UNHCR and the need for maintaining the funding for the UNHCR based on the 67 Protocol and the 1951 Refugee Agreement, I think is very important too. So I'd say those things. So like maintaining the funding, facilitating third country, you could say, resettlement, because they've already been resettled once, in order to alleviate the burden on the countries that are facing. And also to promote integration that doesn't necessarily lead to political entrenchment that scares, I think, some of the countries that have taken in Syrian refugees, is all very important. thinking about refugees in a long-term way and thinking about refugee crises as integration and not kind of like short-term emergency relief is a much easier way to look at, like a more, not easier, but more practical way to look at refugee crises. Because people settle down when they move away from a place and it becomes difficult for them to go back to that place usually. So I think as a political thing, it's difficult for some countries to accept that fact, because it's like you're adding sometimes some constituencies to your government that you didn't have before. So you have to kind of negotiate the political status of people along with their like economic, social status. But I think one of the solutions would be to start thinking about refugees in a long-term integration fashion and thinking about how refugees could benefit the communities that they've moved into. Because sometimes there is this tendency to restrict refugees' movement, to restrict their ability to work, and that those two things specifically starve refugees one, and then also kind of creates like areas of destitution if refugees don't have the opportunity, even in the areas that they're confined to grow. And we've seen a lot of places where people were kind of like stuck in specific areas. So Kenya is a good example because of the major refugee camps that were built for Somalis in Kenya, in Kakuma, and also in Dadaab. And Kakuma even took in other refugees from different areas. But if refugees have the ability to create markets and also to be self-sufficient in certain capacities in the place they live and build up the places they live to make them like actually homes and not like tents in the desert, which sometimes they end up being, then there's like opportunities for refugees also to help themselves and help the communities that they live in. There's like synergy that can happen between refugees and the communities that they live in. And we've seen that also in Jordan as an example, in the Zaatari camp. Most Syrian refugees in Jordan, for the record, and Iraqi refugees don't live in camps, so they do contribute to their immediate communities because they're part of their immediate communities in major cities like Irbid and Amman and Mafraq. But their ability to work is restricted in a lot of ways. So this kind of like black market type of work also restricts their rights, and in certain ways I think kind of hides the economy of the country. So that's difficult, but in these kind of confined spaces where people have been able to build up markets and kind of like have like their own autonomy in certain ways to live, to grow, and to work, I think that can be an example for other places that have chosen to go on with the camp-based approach as opposed to the urban integration approach. And in the places where we've done urban integration, for instance in Turkey and mostly in Jordan too, I think it's a good idea also to give refugees more or greater facility to get work permits, while also taking into consideration how to communicate that back to the refugee community and the public, because a lot of these countries are also dealing with their own internal economic issues related to unemployment and other things like inflation. So you have to kind of like also communicate those challenges to the people, so it doesn't just seem like certain groups are being disenfranchised and other ones are being promoted, or nobody feels like they're getting anything and they start blaming other groups, so that becomes like a difficulty.